If you're new to Ask Reddit cheating drama, make sure to subscribe and like the video. It only takes a few seconds, but it really motivates us to create more crazy cheating stories. Now, let's get into the story. I've never liked silence, but I've gotten used to it. It fills the corners of this house like dust, settling between the walls, slipping under doors, clinging to everything I touch. Some mornings, I wake up and forget what a voice sounds like unless it's my own, talking to no one in particular, or the distant hum of a TV left on for comfort. My name is Sophie. I'm 24, a graphic designer, or at least that's what I tell people when they ask. In truth, I spend most days holed up in my room, laptop humming beside me, staring at blank canvases, and trying to create something that feels like purpose. I work from home, freelancer, introvert, ghost. My mother, Linda, is hardly ever home anymore. She's a senior project manager for some global consulting firm, always flying to New York, London, Singapore, cities that sound glamorous but have pulled her further and further from me over the years. When I was a kid, she used to kiss me goodnight and braid my hair. Now, she leaves sticky notes on the fridge that say things like, "Left early for the airport, be good, love you." It's been this way for a while, just me and the house. But this time, she's gone for longer than usual, 6 weeks on assignment in Tokyo. She didn't leave me alone, though. David's still here, my stepfather. My mother married him 5 years ago, after a whirlwind relationship that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen since before my dad died. He's tall, composed, the kind of man who always seems to know what to say or when not to say anything at all. In the beginning, I kept my distance. I called him David, never Dad. I thought of him as hers, not mine. But lately, the way he looks at me lingers a bit longer. Or maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe it's the silence, playing tricks on me. We don't talk much, but we pass each other in the hallway. I notice the way he takes his coffee, black, no husker. The way he reads the newspaper in the morning, always in the same armchair, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. There's something oddly comforting about his routines, familiar, safe. And maybe that's the problem. Because for the first time in a long time, I don't feel invisible. And that scares me more than the silence ever did. It started with coffee. That's how most dangerous things do, I suppose. Quietly, innocently, disguised as kindness. It was the third morning after Mom left. I had barely made it down the stairs, still wearing an oversized hoodie, hair a mess, when I saw a mug already waiting for me on the kitchen counter. Steam curled into the morning air like a question left hanging. "I figured you'd be up late working again," David said, not looking at me, just stirring his own coffee. Calm, casual. I don't know why it made my chest feel tight. Maybe it was the fact that he noticed my late nights, the shadows under my eyes, the way I never ate breakfast anymore. Maybe it was just the fact that someone thought of me. "Thanks," I murmured, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic. I didn't meet his eyes. That was the first time I realized how quiet his voice could be when it wasn't talking to my mother. How it dropped a few decibels, softer, almost careful, like he was trying not to break something fragile. From there, the moments accumulated, slow but steady. He began asking about my work, not just "how's it going?" but real questions. Ones that showed he was actually paying attention. He'd pass behind me while I was designing and glance at my screen. "You have an eye for color," he said once. "Your father was an artist too, right?" It startled me how much that comment moved me. I nodded, and something tightened in my throat. David never tried to replace my dad, but in that moment, he remembered a part of me that even my mother didn't bring up anymore. One night, we ended up watching a movie together. Not planned. I came downstairs for water, and he was already halfway through some old black and white classic. I paused, hovered by the doorway. "Come sit. You might like this one," he said, patting the space beside him on the couch. I could have said no. I should have. But I sat down. The distance between us on that sofa felt carefully measured, respectful. But I was hyper aware of every inch of it. Every time our arms shifted, every time his hand moved, even slightly. There was no touch, nothing improper, just heat, just presence. When the movie ended, he looked over at me and said, "You remind me of one of the characters." "Which one?" I asked. He hesitated, then smiled. "The one who sees more than she says." I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't love. Not yet. But something in me had tilted. And I think I didn't want to straighten it back. I started avoiding mirrors. Not because I was ashamed, at least not yet, but because every time I looked at myself, I wasn't sure who I was anymore. Something about my reflection felt unfamiliar, like a stranger trying on versions of me I hadn't agreed to become. I told myself I was imagining it. The way David lingered in the doorway when I laughed. The way his gaze softened when I entered the room. The way he said my name, not like a father, not like a friend, but as if it tasted different in his mouth. I tried to ignore it. I really did. But the moments kept happening. They weren't grand, dramatic things. They were quiet, dangerous in their subtlety. Like the time his hand brushed mine when we reached for the same book on the shelf. Neither of us moved for a second too long. Or when he stood behind me while I worked, leaning a little closer than necessary to see my screen. I could feel his breath near my neck. I didn't move. I wanted to, but I didn't. What scared me wasn't that he noticed me. It was that I noticed him back. I began to wait for him. Not obviously. God, never obviously. But I timed my walks to the kitchen when I knew he'd be there. I lingered on the stairs if I heard him in the living room. I dressed more carefully, pretending it was just for comfort, pretending I didn't want him to see me. And yet, every time our eyes met, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something I didn't have the courage to name. He never touched me, never said anything inappropriate, but the space between us grew heavy, charged, like the silence before a storm. At night, I lay awake and asked myself questions I wasn't ready to answer. Why does he make me feel seen in ways no one else has? Why do I feel alive when he's near, like the version of myself I forgot I could be? And why do I feel so afraid of wanting something I should never even think about? I began to resent my mother, not for loving him, but for not noticing him the way I did, for walking past him, distracted and distant, while I sat in the shadows, burning. I hated myself for feeling that. I hated myself more for not being able to stop. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day no one remembers. Gray sky, quiet air, the world moving just slow enough to let something forbidden slip through. I was in the kitchen, barefoot, pouring wine I hadn't asked permission to open. I told myself it was just a glass, just to take the edge off the stillness. I didn't expect David to come in, but when he did, he didn't seem surprised. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching me. Then he smiled, that slow, thoughtful smile he only used when we were alone. "Pour me one, too?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded, pretending my hand wasn't trembling. I handed him the glass without looking at him, but I could feel his fingers graze mine, longer than necessary, warmer than I remembered. We sat in the living room, the two of us, a muted jazz record playing somewhere in the background, like a heartbeat we didn't want to acknowledge. The wine made my skin feel too tight. The air felt full of things unspoken. We talked about nothing. Music, books, the way time seemed to slow when the house was this quiet. And then, in a pause between sentences, he looked at me with a softness I didn't know how to hold. "You've grown into someone remarkable," he said. My throat went dry. I should have said thank you. I should have laughed it off, changed the subject, stood up, walked away, anything, but I didn't. Instead, I looked back at him, fully, openly, and in that moment, I think we both knew what was about to happen. He reached out, slowly, like giving me time to stop him. His hand brushed a strand of hair from my face, an innocent gesture, almost paternal, if it hadn't lingered the way it did. My breath caught. I didn't pull away. When he leaned in, it was hesitant, careful, like a question, and I answered it. The kiss was soft, barely there, but it split my world in two. It was wrong. Every part of me knew that. And still, I leaned in again. When we pulled apart, there was a silence so deep, it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. "I'm sorry," he said, voice hoarse. "So am I whispered. But we didn't stop. That night, in the dark of my room, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The kiss kept replaying in my mind, slow, deliberate, sacred, and sinful, all at once. I felt electric. I felt ashamed. I felt more alive than I had in years. And that terrified me. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand explosion, no dramatic declarations, just a slow, quiet undoing. We didn't speak of the kiss for days, but the silence between us changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed, thick with memory, with what we both knew and refused to name. Every brush of his hand, every glance that lingered too long, it all carried the echo of what we'd done. And then it happened again and again. It became a rhythm we fell into without meaning to. Stolen moments in shadowed hallways, whispered words behind closed doors. Sometimes it was just a touch on my back as he passed by, or his hand on my waist a second longer than needed. Other times, it was more. We never spoke about what we were. There were no labels, no plans, only heat, only need. He would knock softly on my bedroom door some nights, just after the lights went out. I never said yes. I never had to. The door would open, the floor creaked once, and then it was just skin against skin, mouths searching, breathing each other in like we were starving. But it wasn't always physical. Sometimes the most dangerous part was how he looked at me, like I was the center of something sacred, like I mattered, and I let myself believe it. By day, I played the role of daughter, quiet, polite, smiling at my mother's voice on the phone, pretending everything was fine. By night, I was something else entirely. I didn't even know what word to use for what I had become. The shame didn't come right away. At first, it was euphoria, this dizzying high of being wanted, being seen. But slowly, like rot beneath the surface, the guilt began to grow. I started avoiding my own reflection again. I flinched when my mom called. I began to wonder if people could see it on my skin, if it showed in the way I walked, the way I avoided eye contact, the way my voice faltered when I said her name. Every time David touched me, I felt two things at once. Like I was being worshipped, and like I was being erased. I wasn't just betraying her, I was betraying myself. The version of me that once believed in boundaries, in goodness, in love that didn't come with bruises on the soul. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Because in the wreckage, in the wrecked parts of me that had gone so long without affection, without meaning, he made me feel alive. Even if it was killing me, it ended on a whisper, not a scream, not a slammed door, not even an accusation, just a shift in the air, a change in the way he looked at me. I noticed it one morning. He was sitting in the kitchen, coffee in hand, staring blankly out the window. The jazz station played faintly in the background, as it always did, but the warmth between us, it was gone. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, careful, testing. He nodded, but didn't look up. "Yeah." Just that. Yeah. No smile, no sideways glance, no secret smirk meant only for me. And I knew. Something had shifted. Something had closed. That afternoon, he didn't stop by my room. That night, the hallway stayed empty. Days passed and the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't soft. It was heavy, cruel. I tried not to panic. I told myself he was busy, distracted, worried about my mom coming home soon. But something in my gut twisted tighter with every hour. I'd text him simple things. Dinner or you home? Sometimes he replied, sometimes not. But the tone was different, colder. And then, one night, he came to my door, not to enter, but to say the words I'd been dreading. "This has to stop, Sophie." Just like that. No explanation, no apology. I remember staring at him, feeling like the floor had vanished beneath me. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to speak. "Why now?" His eyes flickered, jaw tense. "Because it was never supposed to happen. Because she's coming home. Because this..." He paused, looking at me fully for the first time in days. "This can't exist." I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him if it had ever been real or if I'd just been a placeholder for whatever was missing in his marriage. I wanted to hurt him the way his words were tearing me apart, but all I could say was, "So that's it?" He didn't answer. He just walked away. And with every step he took down that hallway, something inside me crumbled. My mother returned 2 days later. She brought souvenirs and stories, hugged me like nothing had changed. I hugged her back, hollow. David played the part of the loving husband again. He stood behind her at dinner, poured her wine, kissed her temple as if I had never existed in that way. And I watched it all, silently unraveling. I thought I could handle it. I thought I was strong enough to pretend, but I wasn't. One evening, I caught my reflection in the glass door and didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked older, sadder, like someone who had been touched and then discarded, like someone who had given too much of herself to someone who would never truly hold her. And for the first time, I let myself cry, not for him, but for me. For the version of myself I had betrayed. It didn't unravel all at once. It was slower than I expected, quieter. A month after my mother returned, I moved out. There was no big confrontation, no dramatic confession. I simply told her I needed space, that I'd found a place closer to the city. She smiled and said she understood, even helped me pack. I think she thought it was growth, her daughter finally leaving the nest. She didn't know I was running, not away from her, but from the version of me that couldn't look her in the eyes. David barely said goodbye, just a stiff nod at the doorway. No words, no touch, no trace of what we'd been. And yet, his silence haunted me more than anything he could have said. The new apartment was small and cold, but it was mine. I filled it with things that didn't remind me of him. New sheets, different mugs, white curtains that let the light in too easily. I tried to rebuild myself from scratch. New routines, new distractions, new lies to tell myself when the guilt came knocking at 2 a.m. But nothing worked. Because when I left that house, I didn't just lose him. I lost her too. My mother, my anchor, my last bit of innocence. And most of all, I lost me. I used to believe that love, real love, was supposed to be something that made you more of who you are, that it lifted you, completed you. But this love took pieces of me and never gave them back. Some nights I stare at the ceiling and try to remember who I was before he touched me, before he looked at me like I was something he couldn't resist, before I let myself become something I didn't recognize. I don't hate him. I wish I did. It would be easier than admitting that I wanted it too, that I reached for it, that in those moments, I was complicit in my own undoing. People talk about betrayal like it's something done to you, but no one ever tells you what it feels like to be the betrayer, to carry the weight of two hearts broken by your own hands. Sometimes I wonder if my mother ever suspected. Sometimes I think she did and chose not to ask. Maybe that's her version of survival. Mine is silence. There are things I'll never say out loud. Not because I'm afraid of the consequences, but because some truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. They hang in the air like smoke, clinging to everything, impossible to wash out. This is one of them. What I had with David, whatever it was, didn't end in flames. It didn't need to. It burned slow from the inside out until I was hollow and didn't even realize it. It's strange what grief looks like when no one knows you're grieving. People assume you're fine. They smile at you in grocery stores, ask how work is going, tell you look well, and you smile back. You say, "I'm good." You say, "It's just been a busy week." You say, "Thank you." But what you really mean is, "I made a choice I can't undo. I hurt someone who trusted me, and I don't know who I am anymore." No one prepares you for the kind of pain that comes from betraying love, both the love given to you and the love you gave away for the wrong reasons. I used to think I fell for David because he saw me, because he made me feel like I mattered. But maybe I fell because I was already broken, because I was starving for affection, and he fed me just enough to keep me coming back, because I wanted to believe that being wanted was the same as being loved. It's not. Want is fleeting. Love is responsibility, and I chose the easier version, only to learn it comes with the heavier price. I don't blame him anymore. I don't even blame myself. Not entirely. What we did was wrong, but what it revealed about me was honest. Painfully, brutally honest. I've stopped waiting for closure. Some stories don't end with forgiveness. Some just end. And we carry the weight of them in the quiet, in the spaces between who we were and who we can never be again. Send.